Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about some data-driven approaches to character motivations and just some tools that you can kind of use. I have a background in psychology and game design and stuff, so I like to share all the tools that I learned to use that a lot of people don't seem to necessarily know about. So, yeah. All
Well,
right.
I'll drift into the background and enjoy the talk, and I'll let you get started.
Lovely. Thank you. Sorry if my cat interrupts us. She's like really curious about what is going on. We've been okay so far. But yeah, this is me. That's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm a game designer at Mighty Kingdom at the moment. I do some product stuff as well. I've done some narrative stuff there. I like doing some high level narrative stuff. So I'm in a lot of the narrative meetings. I don't do a ton of writing, but I like the design side of narrative, which is kind of fun. You can follow me on Twitter if you like. Twitter's on fire, so no stress. But like, there's links to other places on there too. But yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions. So these are some of the talking points I'll be taking you through today. I'll be showing you some tools to define characters and keep them sort of the same person throughout different people working on them in different stages in the project and all of that. I'll be taking you through intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, working with narrative beats and things like that as well, generating story content from characters, the locus of control and how that kind of works, the sort of background of personality psychology and how you can use it for these sorts of things. Some of the Gestalt principles are really handy to know. I mean, everything that we sort of interpret is patterns, and the Gestalt principles are all about patterns. So I will talk you through some of that. And then at the end, I'll show you sort of how I reverse engineered some of this stuff. This is sort of like bottom up stuff, like if you're on a project that doesn't necessarily have an IP, but it's still useful if it does have an IP, and that's sort of what I'll talk about at the end there, how you can use it for that. Yeah, so I'll get started with motivations. So this is one of the best tools that I've used in meetings with where there's a lot of people who don't necessarily have a background in narrative. So when I've been working with stakeholders and clients, a lot of the time they have a vision of what they want, and there'll be narrative designers in the room who have a whole story and wealth of talent and things like that. But sometimes there can be like some mismatches in communications, and the clients don't necessarily have a background in narrative design either. So some of the things that I like to use to keep those conversations on track, but are also really useful for things like making characters sort of relatable and realistic is these motivations. So intrinsic motivations are internal to you. They are things like, if I wanted to pat my cat, I want to do that because I like patting my cat and she's fluffy. But an extrinsic motivation is external pressure sort of coming in. Like if someone told me to pat my cat or something and I didn't feel like it, I don't know. But that's one of the things. You can want to do it too. But the main thing to remember about these two types of motivations is that everyone has a combination of both. There are always external pressures. There are also always like internal drives and things. So, but the big thing to remember is extrinsic motivations, pressure from the outside. They can eventually influence like intrinsic motivation, but as a general rule, if someone is telling you to do a thing and your heart's not in it, you're only going to want to do it for a certain amount of time. You're only going to be motivated to do it for a certain amount of time. So extrinsic motivations usually don't last as long as intrinsic motivations, and that's something that can come up in meetings about characters and things like that too. A lot of the time, clients will maybe be talking about like a lot of extrinsic motivations in terms of what the client might want to do in a certain circumstance or in a certain narrative layout or something like that. But they also need to have a character and a personality too, or else people don't relate to them. So that was a bit about that. What some of the things that I also like to think about at this point is what do they want more than anything, and what is their ideal outcome. That will help tell you about what some of their motivations are too. In terms of this, thinking about the motivations in terms of character development, as I said before, extrinsic motivations tend to be things that a pressure from the outside that people aren't necessarily like that excited about all the time. So they don't really lead to lasting change and growth unless the external pressure really like is a far like longer narrative arc. But that will depend on the types of content that you're making too. If it's things that are like short chapters and there's different characters between them, it probably isn't going to be as much of a big deal for you. And intrinsic motivations are going to be something that you'll lean more on to tell players about their personalities and things like that. So yeah, what do they want and what do they think they want? So often people and characters, it's good to make characters sort of realistic in that sense that they want something, but like, do they actually want the thing? When they achieve it, are they going to be happy with the actual results and consequences, etc.? And of course, like when you're thinking about all of these things, take into account how the narrative arcs work in terms of your product. So, for example, I worked on Lower Decks, which is an idle game, and the game loop and narrative, of course, like a sort of intertwined as they have to be. So we have little cutscenes when players achieve like a milestone award, and when they've achieved a certain amount of milestone awards, they play a mini game, and then it's sort of like the peak of the narrative, and we call those seasons. So like anything, if it's a longer story and you're playing like maybe a typical like premium game, you're going to see a pretty typical narrative arc that happens along with that. With something like a soap opera, it's ongoing, so you're going to have to account for a lot of different narrative arcs that sort of like intertwine with each other and make sure that there's not really too much of a lull, but also let players process what has just happened. So that's a bit on motivations. So this is sort of this diagram, I should have put it on the other slide, but that's okay, is an example of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. The outside circle is outside pressures, and this is eating vegetables, I guess. That was the only thing I could think of. So if I were to eat more vegetables, an internal motivation would be that I really like potatoes and I want to eat them every day because they're delicious. And then extrinsic motivation would be it's better for the environment, which is a nice thing, but yeah. Working synonymously with narrative beats. So last year here, I did a talk with Rebecca Little on data-driven narrative, and that has since been released. So this will sort of intertwine with that. If you want to go and have a look at that at some point, do feel free to. This will build on that, but you don't need to have watched that. It's just something that might explain the narrative beats in that process a little bit better. So in this case, narrative beats are really important for lots of different reasons, but they're sort of key points in the narrative is what I would call them. And I'll sort of show you what that looks like in a little bit. But generally, we'll whittle down like what the big themes are, or even like what the tensions are as well. Something else I did. And like if you're not familiar with narrative, I guess the themes are the equivalent of the game pillars of the narrative. So yeah. In terms of that, what I like to do is try to make sure that the narrative beats and the character traits inform each other. So if you have a high conflict character, you're probably going to see like a lot of social tension in the moments where they're on screen or when they show up in the game and things like that. Obviously, these are going to depend on what the narrative is and where the character is in their journey as well. But they should be informing each other. And when you start to plot out the narrative beats, you'll start to see patterns there, and where you can possibly put those characters in where they kind of make sense. So yeah, on to this. This is sort of this is a screenshot of a big sheet that I made for Lower Decks, and this is an example of some of what I was just talking about. So this isn't something that I designed in the sense that I chose for everything to be put here. This is something I tracked in an episode. So here in the blue, you can see where tensions were the lowest, and red is where tensions are the highest, except for that bit at the beginning where there's nothing actually there. So some of the tensions that we felt were necessary to measure were social tension, danger, and cute moments. So in terms of like things like high conflict characters or the beats and the narrative informing each other, you can kind of see there that we're tracking the characters. What we found, of course, was like that the cute moments were really high when Tendi was involved. And because she's a really lovely, sweet character that gets very excited about things. And she also shows up when the danger is quite high because she's also not very afraid of things. And Mariner, for example, is super high conflict. So she tends to show up in higher conflict, higher social tension scenes. But yeah, that's sort of what it can look like when you're measuring these things. And sort of down the bottom is where I started to show where certain characters were like introduced, just to track that as well, which was useful for us. Here's sort of an example of, this is just made up, what I might measure in terms of like one of the other games that I was working on, like something like Wildlife or Ava's Manor or something, which have been they're done now, so not working on them anymore. But this is the kind of thing that I used to do when I was working on them. So if the themes are mystery, romance, and self-discovery, I usually like to sort of have like 3 strengths of beats. Because like the lighter one might be like sowing the seeds for something to happen later on, that's within that theme. And then the darker ones are ones where like you get a bit of juicy information, and the darkest ones, of course, are like the sort of climax of whatever is happening in that theme. So in terms of ongoing narrative, this is really important to have something interesting happening basically all the time, especially if you're this isn't a good example, but if you're working with a format where a player beats a level and they get a cutscene, in like most match 3s and all of that, a lot of mobile games are like that. You want to be giving them something really interesting basically every time. And the harder the level is, you want to reward them with something really cool. And that can complicate things when like people play a bunch of levels in a row and then they watch like 10 cutscenes in a row. But like overall, people will have like a feeling of like how difficult the levels were to play, and then the reward being the cutscenes and the story and all of that should help them sort of stay motivated to keep playing and things like that. These are 2 methods that I use to track beats and things like that. Neither are better or worse, but the bottom one, of course, is like it just is or it isn't. It's more of a binary system. But yeah, that's sort of what it can look like. And so generating story content from character traits. This is some more of the lower deck stuff that I did. So as you can see here, Mariner, really high social tension. And you can see sort of like here the gray in the line graph. The gray is sort of where the social tension is. That's also happened to be where Mariner tended to show up. And Mariner's like one of the main characters. She's in there a lot. There's definitely scenes where like it's lower key, but overall like her social tension's really high. And this chart down the bottom here helps us remember and communicate to the client that we know these characters and we know who they are and what they're doing. If a new writer comes on or a new designer comes on, they can look at this and go, oh, okay, like if I'm in a meeting and the narrative designers are talking about the story, the social tension probably is going to surround Mariner. The cute moments are probably going to surround Tendi and Rutherford a little bit too. But yeah, I also do other things in my life. I do improv and comedy and stuff like that. And I've done a lot of classes, but I found some interesting things from that, strangely enough, to bring into my work, especially when it comes to narrative and things like that. So some of those things that I like to think about are the most obvious person for a character. This is going to be something like if you have a character who's a hairdresser, you're probably going to have a character somewhere in there that that is their client. The best person, so like maybe it's their best friend and they're there to hype them up, and also the worst person. I don't know, maybe a rival hairdresser across the street or something. I don't know, something like that. But that's three things that already sort of create a story in itself. And you can use that for anything. If it's more of an environmental storytelling situation, you could you can go with best, worst, most obvious location, situation, outcome, and so on. But yeah, narrative arcs and tensions, this is kind of what they look like when they're in a chart like this. And this is kind of what you can do with that. This is all done in Excel. And if you're interested in learning how to do that, I do have my other talk as well with Rebecca Little, which is called like data-driven narrative or something like that. But yeah. So that is how we track it and show clients that we're doing the things and all of that. So the locus of control, this is another tool that I found really easy to use, very straightforward, and keeps characters fairly consistent. So this is basically the level of influence that a person believes they have over an outcome. And like an internal example is like if I feel like every time I go outside, it just rains, or every time I put my washing out, it rains. So like that is an external locus of control. It obviously doesn't rain every time I put my washing out, but it sure does feel like it. Sorry, that's an external locus of control. An internal example is like, if I do my washing at the right time, then it won't rain on my washing. But yeah, I'll give you another example in the next slide, which will make a little bit of sense too. Of course, like people have facets. People are going to think internally or externally in terms of this, depending on the different challenges they face and depending on their prior experiences. But that's all, like this is a simplified version of it, I guess. So this is one of the questions. You can take this locus of control test pretty much anywhere online anyway, but this is a really good example of one. So like those people who like are like, you could work really hard and make it to the top. You just gotta pull yourself up by your bootstraps or something. They have an internal locus of control because they feel like they can do anything if they just try hard enough. And an external locus of control is more conscious of the things going outside of that. You know, that people might not be able to do that because they don't know the right people or they don't have the right background or, you know, things like that. But yeah, easy to take online, and it will very easily give you an idea of how this can kind of work in terms of characters. Personality psychology. So I have a lot of feelings about personality psychology. It's very stiff culturally, I feel, and its background is a little strange for something to be really considered a bit of a hard science, as much as I feel some people do take it. But it is a really good tool for things like this. It is, though, very specific to like basically like white culture because it was taken from an English dictionary. They took every word that they could that described personality, and they grouped them into ones that they felt like the definitions matched until they had 5. So we refer to that as the big 5. So we have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And they are basically like the big 5 that people categorize personality traits. So this is great for the hit by a bus scenario, which is that if something happens to me and I can't come in for the next 3 weeks at work, someone else can look at the documentation that I've done and just do my job, which is a great thing to have because things just happen, and it's just good to be safe. But yeah, so these personality traits can be arranged into 16 very easily accessible personality types that are available just on the internet, and they're already categorized into different types, which I'll show you on the next slide. They're just super easy examples to just put a couple of letters next to in the documentation of a character profile, and then you have a lot of information about them already. So I won't go through all of them, but these are some of the different types of personalities that you can take inspiration from, or you can categorize existing characters as, and then your documentation will be a lot easier and a lot easier to access than just read through. If you have sort of examples like this, obviously characters will change and grow and all of that, but that can all be documented too, I guess. But yeah, that's personality psychology, and this is something a little bit different, but something that I like to talk about in terms of narrative design and design, and just I think it's useful for anyone who works in anything where anything is communicated at all. So the Gestalt principles are basically how humans perceive patterns. When you're looking at narrative beats and you're looking at characters, good characters are consistent characters, right? They are relatable. They are human. They maybe not in the literal sense, but they feel like they are. And the way we can kind of do that is by creating patterns. So if you're blotting out narrative beats, these are some of the ways that you can think about patterns. And obviously this is visual, but it can sort of be construed into like more narrative sort of ideas as well. So some of these, I won't talk you through all of them, but some of these are like continuity, which is the middle on the top, where if something is one color, you might assume that they're sort of divided into two halves and they keep going. But yeah. And like closure sort of creates a shape without there being that shape existing, and proximity, of course, is like, yeah. But by thinking about patterns in this way, you can start to communicate certain aspects of your characters in ways that that players will pick up on more regularly, because if someone is very adept at narrative design, I don't think any of these are really necessary. It can be quite intuitive. But for people who are not as adept at it or not as experienced, these are some really good ways to start communicating things. Something that we're told at work all the time is to account for the lowest common denominator, which is like someone who's not really paying that much close attention to the story, but 5 cutscenes in, they're like, oh, but I'm lost now, and I wonder how that happened. But it happens. But these are some of the things where you can look at that sort of start to teach you how things are perceived and how players will interpret patterns or interpret things not as patterns. For example, like common fate, if you have 2 characters going through a similar journey, there will be I guess, like an association with those 2 characters in the player's brain. So you can use that for your story as well. You can compare them, I guess, or you can sort of make it so their endings are very different, and then that says something else as well. But yeah, that's just something that I find interesting, that helps me understand things like that, especially when I'm plotting out story beats and stuff like that. But yeah, reverse engineering character traits from existing media can be a little bit of a challenge. Not everyone relates to every character, and that's okay. And when you're writing or you're planning story beats for characters that you don't feel connected to or you don't quite understand, it can be a little bit more difficult. I feel like even really good writers sometimes just don't vibe with a character, and that's totally okay. But there are still ways to sort of take in the data and plot things out in a way that makes sense for the data, even if it doesn't feel intuitive to you. So this can be used when you're taking inspiration for a character or using a character for reference. If it's kind of based on an idea, like, for example, there's so many different versions of like the Alice in Wonderland story. But also when you're working with clients, sometimes they'll already have sort of a character in mind with like a base personality and stuff like that too. And also really useful if you're jumping on a project that already has characters in it, or if you're working on a sequel or prequel, or if you're working with an existing IP as well. So this is showing you the same thing, the same screenshot I did before. This is what it can kind of look like. I have a lot more that I would have loved to take you through today, but I've got very limited time, and I'll just take you through it very quickly. But it sort of just allows you to, when you feel like there should be a tense moment, say if you're reaching the climax of a narrative arc, and you need some social tension, chuck Mariner in, or your equivalent, of the social conflict sort of character. But yeah, that's how you can sort of use it. Again, I sort of went through and rated the tension on a 1 to 3. So 1 was blue, 2 was purple, 3 was red. 1 being like that it doesn't really exist in the scene, 2 being it's present but it's not a big deal, and then red being like this is a big thing. This is important to the narrative. Like it's a peak in this theme. So then that's where I would put a character like Mariner, for instance. And some of our writers found Mariner is specifically very hard to relate to and write for. So this is the kind of things that you can do as a designer or a product manager or whatever you're doing, or even if you're a narrative designer, to just make things a little bit more clear and help when you're not feeling as inspired as well, but also justify to clients. And this is some of the tensions that we've mapped as well. It's just sort of what it can look like. We've done it scene by scene, or cut scene by cut scene, depending on what we're working with. So again, to the left this time, we've got something a little bit different. This was for a game that we took inspiration for Lower Decks. And it was a little bit hard to sort of figure out because it's really high social tension all the time. It's very rare that there's no social tension in a scene. It just feels like a lot. But then, like, when you look at resource tension, you can sort of see these peaks when you sort of add them together. There's usually a problem in the beginning. There's something that might happen in the middle that's not as big. And then there's, like, sort of the tension all cumulates comes together at the end there. But yeah, I think I just put that in to explain the other thing. But yeah, thank you for coming. I don't think we really have time for questions, but I really appreciate everyone who's come to my talks. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Emma. I have to admit that I am a daily Lower Decks player, and I love looking at data, and I think the two of them combined have just made my afternoon. So I really, really appreciate the insights into this.
I'm so glad. Sometimes I just feel like I'm a mad scientist and I've got like all the red tape and stuff, but it works.
It works, and you should just sell yourself into that role, because I think we'd all appreciate a mad scientist data wizard, especially one who works in games.
Excellent. Well, I guess I'll see you next year.
Very much so.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming along, Emma. Really appreciated.